What's up guys, Anders here with the much awaited 2021 updated class guide for Black Desert. It's about time I get to making one of these, but first we have to go over a couple of things since this is a guide geared toward newer players. Black Desert has 22 classes to choose from as of the date of this video, with more to come in the future. This means it's going to be hard for me to give you an in-depth analysis compared to someone who has been playing a single class since the start of the game. I am one of those players that likes to play everything, so after 5 years, I think I can give you some insight into each class and help you find the one that is right for you. The pitfall many newer players fall in early on is trying to play every class from the beginning and then being led by what is the strongest in the meta, usually by hearing a veteran player complain about a class or hearing the phrase "you need to be so-and-so class to do node wars and be good in PvP." The meta will not matter to you because by the time you as a new player reach the gear level required to competitively PvP, the meta will have shifted and you may be stuck with a class that wasn't as strong as you wanted it to be, or you may realize that PvP isn't even something you want to do in this game. That is why I say try the classes out for a while before fully investing into one class as your main moving forward. For newer players, I need to explain two things: Awakening and Succession. Now, these are the names of the class archetypes that you will have available to you. Almost every class has this. Awakening is unlocked at level 56 and allows you to use a second weapon. Awakening uses both your starting weapon skills and these new Awakening weapon and Awakening skills. For some classes, it becomes a dance of chaining Awakening and non-Awakening skills together. After you unlock your Awakening, you are given the option to unlock Succession. Succession basically disregards your Awakening weapon altogether and focuses on improving your starting weapon and skills. So if you enjoyed the style of a class before it achieves Awakening, you can stick with that style through Succession. Shai and Archer are the only classes to forego Awakening and Succession, but I'll go into why that is when we cover those later. All classes in the game are gender locked, so keep that in mind when making your decisions. I am including some brief skill demonstrations in this video to give you a flavor of what each class can do, but they are very basic, so keep that in mind. Now let's get into the rating system I will be using. I decided to give each class two separate ratings, an Awakening rating and a Succession rating, since they sometimes differ greatly. Now for PvE, this encompasses how good the class is at killing monsters at low level and high end areas. This is an average rating since no one class really excels at every single spot in the game. 1v1 has to do with how good the class is at 1v1 duels in PvP. This is important if you consider yourself a duelist player or need to defend yourself in PvE from another player wanting to challenge you for the grind spot you're in. War shows you how good the class is in large group PvP and siege battles. So that's pretty straightforward. So those are the ratings and explanations out of the way. If you disagree with my ratings, let me know in the comments or over on our community Discord. Now first up, we have Warrior, classic class, male, uses a longsword and a shield, and has a greatsword as its Awakening weapon. Warrior PvE is very good. Its group PvP utility is okay, but outshined by other classes. In terms of skill, Awakening Warrior requires a lot more dedication to do well in all aspects of the game. When Warrior achieves Succession, it becomes easier to play compared to Awakening, but in Succession, his potential is lower in PvP. Warrior has been a stable and dependable class that is currently experiencing a good phase in the meta. He isn't the strongest class, but definitely one of the better ones available right now. Though he may look slow at first glance, his burst mobility is lightning fast, and more often than not can close the gap almost instantly in 1v1 fights. Next up, we have Valkyrie, female class, also uses a longsword and shield and has a great lance as its Awakening weapon. Valkyrie can be seen as the female warrior, but is very different in style and utility. Her Awakening PvE clear is average, only really excelling at high-end areas with high-end gear. In duels, she can be deadly if played correctly, but suffers more than other classes. In group fights, she is a great asset with her Awakening ultimate ability being incredibly deadly, heals, buffs, and reduced damage skills that help the group push on the offensive more easily. She may seem clunky once you awaken her, but she gets better the more you practice. Her awakening weapon has a weight to it, and her role requires a lot of positional awareness in group fights. She's not easy to master, but good Valkyries, though few, are very deadly and very useful. In succession, she becomes faster in PvP, slightly better in duels depending on whether or not you take the Lancia weighty style or you like the more mobile succession style. Her succession skills hit hard, and those succession Valkyries are less sought for in group fights. She still maintains some form of utility in the form of healing, buffs, and negate damage skills, though if you do plan to do war PvP, you will still want to pick up the Great Lance and practice that spec. Next up, we have Berserker, male class, giant race class that uses axes and an iron buster for its awakening. Berserker's PvE clear is good in most areas of the game, not the best, but not slow despite his large stature. Awakened Berserkers are heavily sought after for group fights and wars due to their Q-buff skill in awakening. It allows them to deal incredible amounts of crowd control spam with the force of a small truck being thrown at you. Not only that, but they also have an ultimate ability that allows them to crowd control a large area, making them useful in tactical situations. In terms of dueling, Berserker in general is difficult to master and requires hours of movement practice to be able to win consistently. Succession Berserker gains a slight PvE edge, but suffers in every other category, though he is no slouch either. Succession is able to clear in PvE faster and easier than his awakening spec, but the lack of ranged crowd control and the deadly awakened Q buff make him less desirable in group PvP fights. One of the best classes in the current meta, no question, is Berserker. Next up, we have Wizard, also one of the best classes in the game. Oppressive for quite a while in large-scale PvP and war, male class uses a staff and dagger and orbs called Sphera for his awakening. Wizards are able to cast long-range protected crowd control abilities and damage, are able to teleport around the field as well. They're able to heal their allies and themselves. And they also have an ability called Protected Area that increases allied defenses for a brief period of time. An awakening wizard gives up some of his mobility compared to his succession for more static, large AoE damage, a pet summon, and a grapple ability. Succession does a lot of damage very quickly thanks to their succession ability Quick Cast, where you can instantly cast ability after ability as long as you chain them correctly. In PvE, Wizard is above average, but not the best. In duels, he struggles a bit more, but a very competent Wizard will still be difficult to defeat. Recently nerfed by the developers, but in my opinion still remains one of the best classes in the game. Witch is essentially the female version to Wizard with some exceptions. She uses the same weapons, though her awakening sphere goes by a different name, and she focuses on earth and lightning elements in awakening compared to the water and fire of the Wizard. Her pet summons are also different and relate to her elements of lightning and earth. Instead of the grapple of the awakening Wizard, the awakening Witch gets a block ability that enhances her resistances for a short duration. In succession, she is nearly identical to Wizard, making her deadly, but she has a slightly worse mobility due to her teleports not being able to be used on separate cooldowns like the Wizard. She instead gains protection on her side dash ability and a bit better sustained damage in PvE. In PvP, she is around the same level as Wizard, though I'd say the lack of split teleport is the main reason many tend to go for Wizard Succession instead of Witch Succession. You will see a lot of Witch Awakening since her awakening skills have more range than the Wizard Awakening and deal quite a bit of damage. Overall though, no matter the spec you go for, Witch and Wizard are in the top 5 classes in the game right now. Next up, we have the Dark Knight, a female elven class. She uses a Kriegsmesser and a magical weapon called a Vediant for her awakening. Dark Knight deals high damage, possibly the hardest hitting class in the game after recent buffs. She also has decent mobility, with her dashes having invincibility frames. Their PvE is okay in awakening and exceptional in succession. Duel-wise, she is okay, main weakness being that she has very low defenses, so a true glass cannon class. Dark Knight is flashy and has gone through a lot of nerfs in the past, probably as an overcorrection by the developers for releasing her in such an oppressive state. She was, no doubt about it, the best class in the game when she released in 2017. But it has been only recently that she has received some significant buffs. Despite this, she is not great in war PvP due to how brittle she is, but her awakening lends itself to be more ranged focus, while the succession is more melee and insanely high damage, so if you're able to play the flank role efficiently and have the gear to back it up, you can be very deadly. Next up, we have Sorceress, female, using an amulet and a scythe for her awakening. Potentially the strongest class in the game at high gear scores, she is a mobile dark magic user with decent duels and group fight potential thanks to her almost unlimited invincibility frames and high damage. Her potential power may be high, but Awakening Sorc in particular is not easy to play if you're starting out. This leads to a split opinion about the class. Some say it needs buffs, but those who fight experienced Sorcs demand nerfs. It really goes to show how the class does benefit from practice and dedication to improving in the class. Succession is a little bit easier to get into and has a bit better PvE potential than Awakening at high end, and in group fights, Sorc is able to outright kill a group by herself, or at high gear levels she's able to be annoying and disrupt enemies long enough for your allies to come and help if there's any enemies left standing. In duels, she does well enough, but struggles with large AoE classes like Witch and Wizard and Guardian. Pretty much anything that can slow down a Sorc will give it some trouble, but usually if a Sorc dies, it's due to player error or gear disparity. Overall, not a new player-friendly class, but definitely a class that will shine best with gear and a lot of time investment and practice. Hashashin is a male agility-focused class that uses a blade and dagger and a twin blade for his awakening weapon. The awakening spec allows him to summon sand snakes with skills, burrow underground, and grab from a distance. While his awakening is very competent, his succession kit increases his mobility options and AoE damage by a large margin. In succession, Hashashin is able to mask himself as a tornado while moving around the field looking for an opening to attack. His damage in succession is very high and allows him to quickly jump and appear behind enemies almost instantly. In group fights, he is very slippery and provides the role of flanker or assassin, able to move in, deal damage, and quickly back out of a fight. For PvE, Hashashin Succession is very strong in most zones of the game, with Awakening being a little less efficient. Definitely a very strong class with the ability to punish inexperienced players very easily. Next up, we have Sage, the latest class to be introduced to Black Desert. It's a male class using a Kive, a cube-like object for his main weapon, and a magical weapon called a Kibelius Spear for his awakening. In succession, Sage has the ability to open portals and traverse the field mostly untouched. He is a caster-style class that deals damage from mid-range, but acts mostly as a flanker damage dealer since his defenses are some of the lowest in the game. His PvE clear is among the highest in the game, but he suffers a bit in 1v1 scenarios. Sage Succession is a bit on the slower side, but his awakening imbues him with the power of lightning, increasing his speed and allowing him to traverse the battlefield at a faster rate. His awakening form reminds me of Thor, the god of thunder, but with a spear instead of a hammer. Sage Awakening gains an Arcanan Summon as well that also allows him to deal extra damage, and a ranged grapple useful for quickly taking down slower opponents. While Awakening's clear speed is not as good as Succession, he does gain some advantages in duels thanks to that grapple and extra mobility. Because Awakening is able to keep their base skills, he has access to the portals, making his overall kit very strong. Recently nerfed in Succession due to his damage and kill potential being off the charts in group fights, he now takes a more methodical and thoughtful approach on his damage dealing. With enough gear and experience, he can still be very deadly. Next up, we have Tamer, a female class, younger looking class with a pet summon called Lang. She uses a short sword and a staff for her awakening weapon. Lang does a random crowd control when you order it to attack. That plus Tamer having one of the quickest grabs in the game and incredible burst damage makes her very deadly in 1v1 situations. She is still very weak defensively and difficult to master, so it takes some dedication to play her well. Her awakening kit is very good and her damage output is high, but unlike Sorc, does not have enough reliable invincibility frames to really negate damage, so she'll struggle to stay alive in larger engages. Her succession is on the weaker side compared to her awakening, but the PvE damage and potential overall damage coming out of succession is still very high. You just have to give up the awakening block ability and sub movement from her awakening, so in PvP, the trade-off most of the time isn't worth it. She's a good class overall with obvious shortcomings, and having lost their main utility for group fights, which was their strong ultimate ability, they kind of are now solely flankers like most classes without defined roles in the game. If you do choose Tamer, there are usually a few Tamer masters you can at least learn from, as the class seems to have the most loyal player base, so once a Tamer, always a Tamer. Tamer makes it the last of the magic damage dealers in Black Desert, so Tamer, Dark Knight, Sorceress, Witch Wizard, Hashashin, and Sage all deal magic damage. That means the next two classes will have passive resistance against them, Striker and Mystic being those classes. Now let's start with Striker. He uses a gauntlet for his main weapon and a guard brace as his awakening weapon. He is very tanky thanks to his magical defenses and passive evasion buffs, and has deceptively high damage aided by his clones and awakening. Think of them as sort of stands like JoJo. He's very good in PvP and he has a lot of protection, and damage output is quite nuts. You could be much weaker than your opponent and your skills themselves will maybe not deal that much damage, but your clones will probably finish the job. They scale very well early on. And even at high-end gear, Striker becomes almost unkillable if you have enough gear. Succession is the best PvE grinder in the game, probably tied with Sage Succession in that regard. Succession does lose some protection in PvP and the clone damage, but the damage output of his skills are incredibly high, so in duels you should be fine. In group PvP and war, however, I'd say Striker Awakening is a bit better than Succession thanks to the protection, but he is not on the level of the most sought after classes like Witch and Wizard. But overall, Striker is fairly easy to pick up, I'd say. Harder to master, of course, but a very good class. Now, as for Mystic, the female counterpart to Striker, she uses the same weapon, so Gauntlet, and a Cestus for her awakening weapon. She is more defensive in her awakening than Striker and has a lot of utility and crowd control abilities, so focusing on crowd control and slowing down opponents rather than the raw damage output. She gains a Water Dragon summon that appears in certain skills. In terms of raw damage, she is a bit lacking in awakening, I'd say, but her Succession has all the damage. She loses the flexibility of added crowd control abilities and Water Dragon summons in Succession, but in exchange her damage output increases dramatically and she's able to stay infinitely protected. Succession has greater mobility, greater damage, and much better PvE clear than an Awakening counterpart, but suffers in group PvP. Both specs are good duelists, but Awakening is a lot better for group fights thanks to the utility she offers, extra crowd control abilities, slows, all very useful in group fights and war. I would say she isn't as good as Striker right now, but she's very close. Next up, we have Nova, one of the newer classes to the game. She uses an Iron Mace and Tower Shield for her weapons, and a rapier-like magical weapon called Sting for her awakening. A very unique class with a chess theme. She is able to summon pawns that defend her as she does abilities in her Tower Shield form. Those pawns become a demon dragon in her Succession, believe it or not, where she sacrifices her own health pool to deal more damage. The damage output of her Succession is incredibly high, and her summoned demon dragon damage allows her to deal a lot of PvE damage even at lower gear levels. The downside is that she's a bit on the slow side, but if you want to go fast, Awakening goes very fast. Her burst mobility in Awakening is incredible. So much so, I'd say it's difficult to control when you first play her. You're going to end up inside some trees and rocks, and you're going to have to get used to your movement distances. Awakening has an ability called Acceleration that makes her even faster and deal incredible amounts of damage for a short duration. She also has 2 gravity orbs she throws out that travel out and trap enemies daring to get too close into a vacuum, making her very effective in group scenarios with that one awakening ability. Though that vacuum strength has since been nerfed in recent patches, it now loses its strength as it travels further away. It's still very useful. Both specs, Succession and Awakening, are able to also put up an ice wall that negate all incoming skills for a few seconds, making her clutch in certain group fights. In duels, both are good thanks to their pawns able to crowd control enemies and her ranged grapple able to punish anyone who gets too close. Overall, Nova is one of the most underrated and sleeper OP classes in the game right now. Now on to Ranger, the female elf class. She uses a longbow and dagger for her weapons and a Camisylvian sword as her awakening weapon. Ranger has been a class that has been average for a long time. Succession came and made her one of the best PvE grinders in the game, but was quickly nerfed to the ground, unfortunately. She is still an above average PvE grinder in both Succession and Awakening, Awakening, but is outshined by other classes. In terms of 1v1, her Awakening kit is good, but not easy to pick up and play. There are a lot of nuances about the class you need to master to consistently do well. When it comes to Succession, she may be one of the worst duelists in the game, mostly due to the lack of protection. In terms of damage, Succession has it, but that's pretty much it. That's all she has. She practically will come out of the gate shooting arrows, hoping they melt you, before you're even able to get close to punish the unprotected skills that they're using. Succession is very good in group PvP, however, and war scenarios. Usually, if you're not focused, you're free to rain down some heavy damage at a distance, though the playstyle is not exactly what I would call exciting in group fights. Awakening is a lot more active and allows for more flexibility, but will be strictly a flanker role in those types of group fights. PvE is decent for both, like I said, but the main thing that sets Ranger back is the lack of added damage when hitting targets in the back. Rangers unfortunately do not get that bonus damage from back attacks like many other classes do, so Ranger ends up being bad choices to PvE with in some late game areas of the game. Overall, she's a middle of the road class compared to newer classes, but hopefully down the line we get some more buffs for the class. Next up, we have Ninja, a male assassin class. He uses a short sword and katanas as his awakening weapon. For me, the coolest looking class in the game. Ninja is great in PvE, in Succession, okay in Awakening, though he's getting some buffs recently, and he is a very high APM class, so you'll need a lot of inputs if you're starting out. Grinding may actually become a little bit tiresome till you get used to it. His dueling potential is high, meaning he is one of, if not the best duelist in the game. Awakening has more options than his Succession counterpart in 1v1, but both are very strong and deal a lot of damage in PvP. In war, ninjas in either Awakening or Succession will have a similar role of disruptors or assassin flankers. The counterpart to Ninja, Kunoichi, is a similar style of class in the same respect as Ninja. Kuno uses a short sword as her weapon and a giant chakram as her awakening weapon. Kunoichi in Awakening is a decent grinder with good sustain and fairly protected kit. Succession, however, is a bit better in the damage side of things. She's a bit more bursty in damage potential. She does a little bit better in some spots, but a lot worse in other spots depending on where you're grinding. She still plays the assassin role in group fights and is an excellent duelist. Succession also has better burst mobility compared to Awakening, but Kuno in general does not really tend to be a popular class, though she really is very close to Ninja in power level in PvP. In PvE, she's a bit behind. Still one of the best duelists, high damage, very deadly, if not respected. Next up, we have Musa. Musa is a male class that uses a blade and hornbow with a crescent blade as his awakening weapon. Musa has excellent mobility, allowing him to move from pack to pack with ease in PvE, but their PvE damage in both Awakening and Succession are really not the best. Succession is slightly better depending on the zone. In 1v1, Musa Awakening also requires a lot of skill to do well in, but is fairly protected, allowing him to sometimes dictate the flow of the battle thanks to his mobility. He can choose to disengage whenever he wishes as long as he's not slowed, which can lead to very long passive gameplay from Musa's. For the most part, Musa does reward dedication and time commitment to the class. You can easily spot a good Musa from a bad one, but in wars, Musa's really going to be just a flanking, maybe scout class that can get around with ease. His ability to disengage with speed is especially useful when scouting and flanking, but with the prevalence of range slows, Musa struggles to really keep his speed and momentum right now. Overall, he's a great class for beginners who want mobility and okay PvP and PvE. Maehwa is the female counterpart to Musa, and I'd say around the same power level, more or less, right now in the meta. She uses a blade and hornbow as well, with a spear as her awakening weapon. She is similar to Musa in that she has great mobility. Like I said, Maehwa Awakening also has a lot of crowd control potential and leads to the ability to outplay risky opponents. Succession has less options, but makes up for it with very hard-hitting skills. Like the Musa, she sometimes can fall back on a more passive playstyle in 1v1 due to the nature of not having a grapple, crowd control, control to really force pressure on an opponent, but like the Musa, you can tell good Maehwas from bad ones. In PvE, she's okay, but in group fights, she will remain strictly as a flanker role. She'll need to be very practiced and geared to fully utilize what the class has to offer. Awakening Maehwa is one of the most enjoyable classes in the game, as long as you're not fighting too many of the top tier classes back to back. So hopefully down the line, both Musa and Maehwa can get some more buffs to their classes, so those two classes can get a little bit more popular than they are right now. Next up, we have Lahn, a female dancer style class that uses Crescent Pendulum and a Noble Sword as her weapons, as well as a Kratos-like glaive as her awakening weapon. Lahn is unique in the fact that she can glide through the air, making her more vertical than other classes in the game. She has a lot of protection in both Awakening and Succession, with Awakening giving her a mid-range grab and a lot of HP regeneration on her skills. This allows Lahn to effectively grind in PvE without using as many potions, unlike other classes. Her Succession loses the grab and HP regeneration, but gains a lot of AoE damage and defensive traits. In duels, Lahn Awakening has the edge thanks to that grab, but Succession has incredible damage that makes up for it as well. Succession is especially very strong in PvE grind at high end. In group PvP and war, Lahn is more serving as a flanker assassin, able to disrupt and get some kills before flying away before she gets deleted. She is very squishy in general, so you can't live too long in group fights. She is, I'd say, a little easy to pick up, but hard to master. Overall, she is one of the least popular classes in the game right now, but also one of the strongest in terms of potential. Awakening Lahn specifically, low-key one of the best duelists in the game thanks to her mobility, invincibility frames, and range grab that make her deadly against most opponents. Next up, we have Guardian, a female class using a battle axe and shield and a halberd as her awakening weapon. She is one of the best PvE grinders in the game with her awakening. Her AoE is large and damage output kind of absurd. She can outgrind classes much higher in gear than her and can grind areas with lower defenses than what is suggested thanks to her passive tankiness. She has protection in almost all of her skills. She has invincibility frames that linger through animation and awakening. She can negate damage quite a bit. She has heals on her skills and awakening as well. She has a protected grab, and her skills have a deceptively long range in both awakening and succession. Her succession is a bit more utility focused, giving allies defensive buffs, so she trades the ranged AoE damage in favor of those utility options. Most players play Awakening for the sheer damage potential and ease of grind, one of the lowest APM classes to grind with, so easy on the fingers. You won't really get arthritis playing this class. She is easy to learn and very easy to play, though in duels she suffers a bit against grab classes as her animations are a little predictable. Succession is a bit better in 1v1s, just a little bit faster mobility. In group PvP and war, Awakening currently is one of the best classes and sought out just as much as Witch Wizard, Valkyrie, and Berserker. Succession struggles a bit compared to Awakening in war and group PvP, though she can still deal some hefty damage and be very useful. But in PvE, Awakening is just better with those AoEs overall. The one class I would say is the best starter class for anyone playing Black Desert for the first time, trying to be as efficient in their progression as possible, is going to be Guardian Awakening. You want to play Guardian Awakening if you want to progress fast in this game. Moving on, we have Archer, the male elf class. Archer comes already with Awakening unlocked from level 1 and does not have a succession. He uses a great bow and a crossbow. His strength is his range DPS and protection. He can be very mobile and deals heavy damage from range. His hardest hitting skills do leave him fairly stationary and vulnerable, though he is able to move around and almost dance around the battlefield looking for one of his many crowd control range skills to land before he slides up on you and deletes you. In PvE, he is fairly good up until the latest endgame areas, where unfortunately the big weakness starts to show, and that is Archer is, defensively speaking, the weakest class in the game. He simply will not be able to casually grind later areas unless you are incredibly geared, meaning you have to invest a lot more silver into your gear to grind, unlike some other classes. In duels, he does well against weaker opponents, but struggles against against anything with ranged damage, since at high gear level fights, his protection and guards may not be enough to find a moment to crowd control and then finish your opponent. In group PvP and war, he does well if left alone, but again, his relatively squishy nature prevents him from being anywhere near the main blob, so you'll be mostly a flank or ranged assassin. Archer, while needing some help, can be very powerful. A very geared archer is a scary thing, and the class lends itself to being one of the more fluid and satisfying to play classes available in the game. He just needs a little bit of help defensively to allow him to survive long enough to be a threat, and also be able to grind newer areas in the game like other classes. Finally, we have Shai, a female elven-like class named after a race in the game of the same name. Shai is the most unique class in Black Desert. They don't have an awakening, they don't have a succession, rather they gain a talent. Shai was made to be a support lifeskiller class, so their kit is filled with heals and party buffs. They are essential in group fights and surprisingly do well in high-end PvE spots, but unfortunately their mobility is terrible, making them slower to grind with in lower-end areas. In 1v1, she stands no chance with anyone with any semblance of gear. She has heavy PvP damage reductions on all of her skills, making them hit like wet noodles. In terms of difficulty, she's fairly easy to pick up, but in group fights, you will have to adapt to tactics and have some positional awareness to do well. Most Shai players also aim to do war and group PvP with defensive gear, so they'll gravitate towards a defensive build, making them more difficult to kill. This is expensive if you also choose to grind for money. Shai starts out with Alchemy and Gathering already leveled to Professional 1, which is decent and has some passives that lend it to be a very good life skiller or profession class if you wish to do that route. Though keep in mind her mobility sometimes is a negative and you may not want to make her your primary Gathering life skiller, for example, because she's just a little too slow to get from node to node. Her passive leveling gives her added weight capacity, which is great if you are a free-to-play player looking to save some money on weight. And lastly, Shai is able to compose music through an in-game composition engine that's very good. You can also upload and share your music to other players in the game and will get ratings depending on community likes and dislikes. You can even create a band and perform for others if you wish, which is pretty cool. Overall, Shai is a good support class, an okay life skilling class, and a good unique class for those wanting to play something a little bit different in Black Desert Online. And that's it for me for this 2021 Black Desert Online class guide. Went through the basics and the flavor of each class. Hopefully it gave you an idea of what classes you may want to check out. In my opinion, if you just want to have fun and enjoy the game, you want to choose a class you like and then master that class regardless of future changes or where they land in the class rankings. Let me know what you thought about this video in the comments down below. If you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them when I get a chance. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell icon to get notified when I upload my next video. Remember, bell is good. You can also join our community Discord. We're now public and accepting new members, so hit that link and react to the comment to get your member role and say hello. As always, guys, thanks again for watching. Thanks for listening. I'll see you all in the next one. Take care.